Welcome in, everyone. This is Sean with MTG 808 Junior, and school is back in session. That's right, we just had our first Magic Youth tournament of the 2017-2018 school year. We had a bit of a lull in terms of running tournaments over the summer, but I was busy working on a bunch of different initiatives to grow this youth project, so I'll be making some announcements about those in the coming weeks. But for today, we're going to be focusing on this first tournament, which took place this past Sunday, September 17th. It was a two-headed giant youth tournament. We had 4 teams show up. They were all really excited to get their magic on again. And today we're going to be going over the winners and the 2 deck lists that they used. Just a couple comments. This tournament took place right before Ixalan comes out. The Ixalan pre-release is this coming weekend. So once Ixalan comes out, the format is going to change a little bit as rotation is happening. 4 sets are going to be rotating out of Standard. That's Battle for Zendikar, Oath of the Gatewatch, Shadows over Innistrad, and Eldritch Moon. They'll be rotating out. They will no longer be legal in Standard or Standard Pauper. But Ixalan will be legal. So we're going to look at the winners' decks and then see how they fare moving forward. So moving on, here we've got Luke and Isaiah. So these are 2 students from Nanakuli Intermediate and High School, or Nanakuli High and Intermediate School, excuse me. And Luke has been playing in our tournaments since the beginning. I think he's played in all of the tournaments that we've run so far. He loves playing Magic. This is his first tournament that he won, and he put a lot of work into preparing for this tournament. More than any of the other teams, I think that he was, getting in practice games of Standard Pauper the week before, leading up to the tournament. He got his buddy Isaiah here to team up with him, and they were telling me that the few days leading up to the tournament, they were just practicing, finding people to play against, playing against each other, just getting games in, and it definitely paid off for them with a first place finish here. So this was Isaiah's first tournament with us, but he said he's known how to play Magic for quite some time. This was just his first time joining us for the tournament here. So Luke and Isaiah, congratulations once again to them from Nanakuli High and Intermediate School. Isaiah played a mono red spells deck, and Luke played a blue green ramp deck, which we're going to take a closer look at here in a second. But they did a good job of pairing these decks together. They kind of covered each other's weaknesses, and they were both just very powerful. So this right here is an image of our Facebook post about them. You can check it out on Facebook. But here we're going to move over to their specific deck lists, which there will be links to these deck lists in the description of this video. So this is the deck Isaiah played, which is mono red spells. And the pillars of this deck are really Firebrand Archer, which says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent, and Thermo Alchemist, who says you can tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you can untap it. Now, the key word on both of these cards, especially in Two-Headed Giant, is it says each opponent. So you'll be doing 2 damage to the opposing team each time you get to use this the ability on these cards. So 2 damage to the opposing team because there's 2 players on the opposing team. So these cards, which are very solid in normal Standard Pauper on their own, are just twice as good in Two-Headed Giant, and Isaiah's deck really takes advantage of these cards. So he's got 4 Firebrand Archer, 4 Thermo Alchemist, and then 4 Shock. Shock is probably the most powerful red spell, or maybe not the most powerful, but the most efficient red spell in Standard Pauper, right? 2 damage to the face, 2 damage to a creature, right? It triggers all these Spells Matter cards, right? Pyrehound gets a counter from it. It'll untap Thermo Alchemist. It'll trigger Firebrand Archer. There aren't any prowess cards in Isaiah's deck, but if there were, they would trigger off of Shock, right? So the core of this deck is very much Thermo Alchemist, Firebrand Archer, and Shock, right? No matter how you build the red deck, I think Firebrand Archer and Shock are going to be in it moving forward. Unfortunately, Thermal Alchemist will not be surviving rotation. It is an Eldritch Moon, so it will not be legal in Standard Pauper once Ixalan comes out, but this deck will still be very powerful moving forward. So just a kind of a bigger picture look at the deck. They've got 10 2-drops, which is a good healthy number for an aggressive deck. They've got only 4 3-drops, only 2 4-drop creatures and 2 5-drop creatures, and then a whole bunch of burn spells, right? I already talked about how good Shock is. It's very cost efficient. It'll very often kill a 2, maybe even a 3-drop, right? So you're trading 1 mana and a card for 2 or 3 mana and a card, so it's just very efficient, very great tempo. Magma Spray does almost the same thing. It doesn't go to the face, but it'll trade with a creature, and it'll just allow the aggressive deck to kind of build momentum that the other player can't deal with. There were a couple games that Luke and Isaiah played where Isaiah just, went turn 2 Firebrand Archer, turn 3 Firebrand Archer Shock, and it was just really hard for a lot of decks to come back from that, right? A smattering of other spells, other removal spells, some utility spells, right? And then 21 lands. This is an aggressive deck. You don't want too many lands, right? 21 is kind of like the lowest that I would go in terms of land count, but this deck, it can operate off of 2 mana, right? The majority of the spells in this deck cost 1 or 2 mana, a couple of 3 mana spells. So 21 lands I think is good. This deck does not want to be running out of gas, right? So this deck will try to attack the opponent, try to burn them out. It's got a lot of reach, which is a term that we use in Magic for effects that will kill the opponent without needing to be in combat, right? Firebrand Archer, Thermal Alchemist, burn spells like Shock or Open Fire that can go to the face. That's a lot of reach, right? This deck is able to close out the game without needing to attack in combat. So very powerful deck, and it doesn't have the greatest late game, but it can definitely close out a game before the opponents can get to their late game. But since it doesn't have the most powerful late game, Luke's deck does a really good job of covering the late game. So they paired the mono red spells deck with this blue-green desert ramp deck. And this ramp deck, the backbone of this deck is these 7-drops. Ramp is a term in Magic that just means that you're trying to cast your expensive spells sooner than you normally would be able to. So he's got this spell called Wild Wanderer. It's a creature. When it comes into play, he gets to search his deck for an extra land and put it into play, right? That's the only ramp spell that he has that gets his mana out faster, but he is just trying to get to 7 mana and cast these giant boom booms, right? A 7 mana 7/7, there's not too much in the format that's bigger than that. A 7 mana 5/5 hexproof, right? Removal spells can't touch this. This is a very hard threat to deal with. So he's got the 7-drops, he's got the ramp, right? And then he's got a bunch of spells in this deck that are going to help slow the game down, right? His partner's deck is trying to kill the opponent and attack very quickly, but if the team finds themselves on the back foot, Luke's deck is very good at covering that. Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs in particular is very good. 2 mana for a 0/4, it's a great blocker. It'll block almost every other 2-drop. Pretty much every other 2-drop in the format. So it'll block every other 2-drop in the format, and it adds to the team's reach, right? That idea of being able to kill somebody without needing to attack them in combat. Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs does say target opponent. It doesn't say each opponent like Thermal Alchemist does, but it does just add redundancy to that effect of you want to be pinging the opponent for little bits of damage at a time. So Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, great at slowing down the game, great at closing out the game. Very good card because Luke is playing the full 8 amount of deserts that he can. He's also got Unquenchable Thirst, which cares about deserts here, right? 2 mana enchantment. If you control a desert, when it comes into play, it'll tap the creature, and then even if you don't control a desert, the enchanted creature won't untap during its untap step. So it's a 2 mana, it's basically a 2 mana removal spell, right? You need to have a desert for it to really be a removal spell, but it's just very cheap. It'll slow the game down. It'll buy Luke time to get to playing his 7-drops, right? So he's got Unquenchable Thirst, and then a little bit of harder removal, Ambuscade. This one requires him to have a creature in play, but it's just very powerful. It buffs up the creature, gives it +1/+0, and then that creature will fight. So, or it doesn't fight, it just deals the damage to something, right? So his giant creatures with an Ambuscade, right? He can take out other giant creatures. Have his Sandworm deal 8 damage to another creature, or Striped Riverwinder deal 6 damage to another creature, right? So Ambuscade, very good at controlling the early game, as well as Unsummon and Leave in the Dust, right? There were a bunch of turns where Luke's early tempo spells with Unsummon or Leave in the Dust, right, allowed Isaiah's cheap creatures to kind of get through and attack. So while the decks do complement each other nicely, I think moving forward just for regular standard Pauper, both of these are very solid starting points if you just want to build a standard Pauper deck for our next tournament. Our next tournament, by the way, is October 7th, which is a Saturday, at The Planet. It is a one-on-one tournament, so not two-headed giant, and Ixalan will be out, so some of these cards will need to be changed. Luke's deck, fortunately, only has one card that will be leaving, which is Watcher in the Web. I think this is one of Luke's favorite cards. He has a soft spot for this card. I think Bitterbow Sharpshooters does a similar thing, so the deck won't necessarily be missing Watcher in the Web that much. But his deck will be a good starting point if you want to play this ramp strategy, right? If you want to win the game with giant creatures, this is a good starting place for you. So I'd recommend you check this deck out. One other comment on this deck is that this deck has 23 lands, which, it's only 2 more than Isaiah had in his aggro deck. But if we look at Attune with Aether, which is a card that searches for a land, right? A 1-mana card, go get a land. Luke, and he can't use the energy that Attune with Aether makes. He's just using it to kind of act as a dual land. He can get a second green source or he can get a blue source with it if he wants to. So if we treat Attune with Aether as a land, the deck really has 27 lands, which is a lot, right? I mean, you need a lot of lands when you're trying to cast 7-drops, so it's not that big of a problem, but 27 lands is a lot more than the 21 that Isaiah had in his aggro deck. And because 8 of his lands cycle, right? These the deserts are cycle lands. Because 8 of these lands cycle, the mana flood is not as big of an issue, right? If you were not playing cycle lands, I think playing 27 mana sources like this will be too much, even for a deck that's trying to play 7-drops. But I think it works out nicely here with the deserts. So moving forward, I think this ramp deck is a good place to start. Moving forward with the red deck, it loses Thermal Alchemist as well as a couple other cards, Pyrehound. It's going to lose Outnumber, it's going to lose Magmatic Chasm, and it's going to lose Uncaged Fury. So not too much. But this deck still has options moving forward. Travis Wu did a deck tech on an Amonkhet Hour of Devastation only standard Pauper mono red deck, and he built it a little differently. But if you wanted to include some powerful Kaladesh cards, I think Aether Chaser is where you want to go. Isaiah was playing only 2 of them in his deck because he was giving priority to his other 2-drops, Thermal Alchemist and Firebrand Archer. But I think once Thermal Alchemist leaves, Aether Chaser is going to be the go-to 2-drop. It 2 mana for a 2/1 first strike. It wins in combat against a lot of different creatures, and it can just make a servo tokens for those times that you want to go wide. So Aether Chaser is a very solid card. If you wanted to play this deck moving forward, I would recommend trying to get at least 4 of these. And then the other card that I think would be a very good fit in any aggressive deck, one of the most powerful cards in the standard Pauper format, is Renegade Freighter. So Renegade Freighter, it's a vehicle, so it's not a creature until you pay the crew cost. This case it's 2, so you need to tap any number of creatures with power 2 or more in order to turn this into a creature. But once it is a creature, it is a 4/3. Once it attacks, it's a 5/4 trample. A 5/4 trample for only 3 mana. You don't get deals better than that, especially not in standard Pauper, right? So Renegade Freighter, one of the more powerful cards in the format. There's lots of 2-power creatures in red that can crew it, right? Firebrand Archer can crew it, Aether Chaser can crew it. If you play Spireside Infiltrator, it can crew it, and it'll deal 1 damage to each opponent when it becomes tapped for the crew, right? So if you're going to be building a red deck, I'd highly recommend checking out Renegade Freighter moving forward. But other than that, I think that these 2 decks are really good starting points. We hope to see you at our next Standard Pauper tournament. If you're not on the island and out there on the interweb checking out this video, thank you very much for checking it out. Hope other people out there are exploring Standard Pauper. Not only is it a really fun, a little more casual format than regular Standard, but it's also just cheap and accessible, right? trying to get kids into the game, I think Standard Pauper is the best format for just making it accessible and showing them the depth of the game, right? Even though Standard Pauper is cheap, there's only commons, it is also, a very developed metagame. So we've got two of the better decks here from the tournament. Check them out. I'll be covering the second place decks either later this week or next week. And yeah, I want to hear your feedback. Thanks for checking out the video. Let me know what you think. And oh, there's my dog. So let me know what you think. What do you think of Standard Pauper? What do you think of these decks? What do you think of youth tournaments? If you have any questions, let me know. Love to hear from you in the comments. Thanks for stopping by. I will catch you later.